in this module is that we really want to bridge that space between engagement and assessment. So you'll see that we start to cover a lot of things that are really assessment oriented. But my goal for you is that you can really equip yourself with this focus on engagement so that assessment does not just become a fact collecting endeavor, but it's a tool that we use to continually engage with clients. The other thing I just want to point out is that you read the Gasker text, which has really good information on I think general considerations, and then you're also reading the Lucas here, chapters 1 and 2. Lucas is not a social work text, so I just want to point that out. It's very concrete. I share it because I think it's useful, and sometimes students just feel like they need to know, what do I do, right? She gives you some very, very clear kind of step-by-step considerations for different types of assessment and different stages. And I think that is useful, but I think I want to make sure that we bridge that, again, with kind of these deeper theoretical considerations and kind of what does it mean to do those things as a social worker, and where might we differ a little bit than other professionals doing those things. So with that, let's jump in here. I'm not going to go over this with you, but I'd encourage you to read page 164 in your Dolgoff text. It's an ethical dilemma, and they do a pretty nice job of outlining the considerations, but I wanted to direct folks to it because it highlights this question of consent, which is a critical feature of engagement, and it kind of highlights these questions of what do we have to do to ensure that we've actually received consent, what do clients need to do to actually give consent, and then this question of competence. The scenario deals with an elderly gentleman, and so this question of how do we know if a client is able to make those decisions autonomously? What do we do if we're concerned that they're not? And I think it raises some good questions. So I'd encourage you to read that and read through their explanation of kind of how they might, again, go through the principal screen in that situation. But moving right along, let's talk about engagement. So what is engagement, right? It's the second step in the plan change process, although we know these aren't discrete steps, okay? Self-reflection kind of leads into engagement. It's interwoven with assessment and intervention. All of these things can occur simultaneously and they inform one another, right? But it has to do with kind of developing a working agenda. There's feeling components, and we should have a huge focus as we're just beginning to connect with clients on these issues of acceptance and vulnerability, knowing that this is potentially the most vulnerable that a client is going to be in the entire process. And so knowing that acceptance and conveying our acceptance of them wherever they are, even when they're reluctant, is really, really critical. So again, this just kind of outlines how these different pieces work together for engagement. So we have acceptance and vulnerability as kind of a pillar at the bottom here. We also need to have that kind of cultural humility and a value of diversity. And those things kind of come together with this need for change that the client brings in order to establish a working relationship between us and the client, right? And that's important. Engagement is building a connection, but it's within the context of a working relationship, not just a personal relationship. Another thing we want to think about in engagement is not just engagement with the client directly, but other system representatives, right? Do we need to connect with representatives of the client's family or other systems that they're connected with, right? We can act as kind of a lead partner and set boundaries for those relationships and kind of control the process. But it's really critical as generalist practitioners and folks who are engaged in multi-system practice, again, to consider how can we ensure that our work is kind of getting the most bang for our buck. And very often that means that we need to involve other client systems or representatives of other client systems who are connected with our client in order to get them where they want to be. Okay. A relationship with a client is based on this idea of mutual partnership, right? There should be intentional efforts on our part to kind of dismantle power hierarchies where they occur. That can be hard, especially in mandated client relationships where that's really reinforced. But again, and this is kind of where a social work perspective might differ from others, but what we really believe in mutual partnership. Within that, there's certainly going to be exploration of feelings, whatever type of work that you do, even if it's more resource-oriented. Emotions are central to the human experience and kind of disclosure of life experiences, exploration of feelings around those experiences is very likely to happen, and I think is a hallmark of kind of effective engagement. Again, even when your professional relationship is perhaps not as centered on emotions as it might be in say, a counseling relationship. All right, so what do we actually do? Some things to think about in a kind of initial engagement with clients is how we look. What appropriate attire looks like is going to be very different depending on where you work, cultural context, all of these things. But I think the central question that I'd encourage you to ask yourself is there any way in which my attire or my appearance, whether that's, just tattoos or piercings or how I do my hair, anything like that, is there any way in which my appearance is going to potentially become the focus of this interaction? And if that's the case, we want to take steps to avoid that. Okay, so I think that's the critical question. And so instead of getting into back and forth about what's appropriate, precisely or not, I think when we ask ourselves that question, we're usually steered in a good direction. We need to smile at clients. Again, they're vulnerable, even when they're resistant, finding places to connect and smile. Using eye contact, but eye contact that's not intimidating. So kind of indirect eye contact can be, again, less intimidating for clients than direct eye contact, where it's hard to do on my camera here, but where you're looking right at the client, right, continually. Also, there's cultural connotations with eye contact, right? Different cultural groups use eye contact very differently to connote respect or disrespect. And so we don't want to make assumptions about what our client does or doesn't do in terms of their eye contact or expect eye contact for them. Again, they're vulnerable in this situation. But using our eye contact to show interest, to show engagement, and to invite our clients to connect with us. Another skill we can use is embodied mirroring. So again, that's not where you're actually mirroring your client and every move they make, but watching their body language and matching it with our own. So if they're leaning in, we might lean in. If they're leaning back, we might give them a little bit more space, right? We want to point out strengths every chance we get, right? And if you can't find any other strengths, just the fact that that person's there, even if they're mandated to be there, just the fact that they're there is a strength. Again, vulnerability is central. So pointing out strengths within that vulnerability is important. And think about handshakes or kind of how we use, physical greetings can be important. Okay. Again, not everyone has the same kind of cultural background in terms of how they greet one another, but, kind of having a clear way to connect with someone, to welcome them, to greet them can be important. And often there's a physical component to that, although we want to be cautious that our physical presence doesn't make folks feel uncomfortable. So, look at what people are kind of putting out there. Adapt your response accordingly. But handshakes can typically be appropriate. In these early sessions, we want to kind of focus on a few things. One is boundary setting, and not just boundaries between us and the client so much, but really boundaries of the relationship. What are we here for? Kind of what are we going to do? What are we not going to do? What can you expect from me? What can I expect from you? And then those conversations again around consent and disclosure of information. When might I have to break confidentiality? What can you expect from me on that front, right? All those things are really important. Once we have those boundaries, though, our goal is really to sit back and let the client give to us, right? Let them tell their story in their own words, right? And us to receive it. So really that active listening piece that we worked on a little bit. In doing that, we might want to think about physical placement. How can we make our clients most comfortable within a space? So thinking about planning our space ahead of time, and once a client comes into the room or whatever our space is, kind of orienting them to that, letting them know where they can sit, letting them know if they need to get, if there's water or tea available, kind of orient them to the physical environment so that they can be as comfortable as possible. And then within that active listening, we really are going to ideally focus on open-ended questions and letting the client tell their story. But there are certainly times where it's appropriate to use clarifying questions and to ask directed, closed-ended questions so that we make sure we understand what they're telling us. Involuntary clients, we're going to focus a lot more on when we talk about motivational interviewing, but some things that can be helpful is to be a little bit more directive, to allow for silence, to be comfortable with silence, and to use open-ended questions again. Those things can all be useful, but we're really going to talk about assessing motivation and kind of what to do with that when we cover motivational interviewing. So I'll leave it at that for now. A couple other things to think about. There are appropriate times to really let our clients vent and just get those feelings out and let them go. And there are times when that can get in the way and we really might need to contain them a little bit because we're we're kind of exceeding the boundaries of the relationship. And so judging that, reflecting on that can be important and kind of help you move in a particular direction. And then your book talks about, and we've talked about in class too, the difference between empathy and sympathy. Okay, so hopefully we engage in preparatory empathy. We're kind of prepared to really at least understand the client's perspective and connect with them on some kind of an emotional level, right? At least understand their emotional state and kind of be with them in that feeling. But sympathy is something different, right? Sympathy kind of means feeling sorry for clients. Now, we may have sympathy for clients, and that's very natural to have that reaction, right? So there's nothing wrong with having that feeling, but this is one of those times where often we might want to display that absent affect. If what we're feeling is sympathy, displaying that sometimes can be disempowering to clients, right? It's much more appropriate again to display empathy than sympathy. So if we're feeling sorry for someone, we might recognize that feeling, we might kind of process it, and then make a conscious choice to display an empathetic response, which might sound something like, "Wow, that sounds really hard," or pointing out a strength or something like that. Then a sympathetic response, which might be something like, "Wow, I feel really sorry for you." Okay. Opening statements. We're going to talk in class about having you kind of form your opening statement. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but again, what we say up front is so essential. It sets the stage for everything that comes after. And I can tell you from experience, having been a client myself, yeah, it can really determine whether or not someone's going to come back. It allows us to make someone feel comfortable. It allows us to let them know what they can, again, expect from us and what we expect from them. It's so critical. And so we'll, again, talk more in class about how to do this well. But we really have a lot to do in those opening statements. And so really start thinking now about what are the first things that you say to client when you really start that interaction, because those things are critical. All right, informed consent. What does consent actually mean? Okay, here's what it means. Here's things that we need to make sure we communicate. What is the purpose of our service? What risks might be involved, right? What is insurance going to cover or not cover? Or at least what is your knowledge? What is your agency responsible for? Okay, costs. Right, whether that's insurance related or separate. Are there other sources of help, other resources, other places that they can go? The fact that they have the right to refuse or to leave treatment at any time, and how long is this consent in effect? So those things are critical that we convey and not just have them sign on a piece of paper. Signing is good because it provides legal documentation and ensures that we've kind of been through a process, but I've been to too many places where they shove a consent in someone's face and have them sign. This stuff needs to be in a conversation, and it needs to be a conversation in which there's back and forth. We don't just go through it and say, "Do you understand?" Right? We talk through each one of these things and we ask something like, "What questions do you have for me?" Okay, at the end. Because if we say, "Do you understand?" the person's going to say yes, they're going to sign. Okay, so making sure we have real conversations about consent is critical. All right. Confidentiality is also important to disclose, right? So it might be a statement like something like, "What you disclose is confidential. It's not going to repeat it outside of the session unless," right? And then we go through our list of exceptions. I'm a mandated reporter, so if can find out something relating to child abuse and neglect, I am mandated to report to get some assistance in that regard. I'm also mandated to report if I'm worried about you harming yourself or harming someone else, right? And so those are situations in which, again, I would reach out to others, hopefully with your cooperation. But if it came down to it, I might need to reach out to others and break confidentiality in those situations. Okay. If you do anticipate that you're going to need to reach out to others, you want to get a signed release of information. So this is maybe you're coordinating with a primary care provider, you're coordinating with a school, whatever it is. Get that up front as well so that you can have those conversations early on as needed. All right. And again, there's limits. We talked about minors and minors' rights, right? Children don't have a right to confidentiality, actually. Their parents are the ones consenting. And so that's important to know. Don't promise a kid that their parents won't find out because you are legally obligated to share with parents. Does that mean you call parents after every session and repeat what they said? No, it doesn't have to mean that. But again, be aware. Age-dependent adults, again. So, adults who are still dependent for some reason, any person who might be at risk, or the client himself or herself, right? Okay, I'm going to pause there. We're going to cover the rest in our class together. All right, take care.